I feel like right now is a great time to be a creator in the music space. I got started with audio recordings when the first inbox was still around. I learned on Pro Tools, and I got started on the AKG C414. That was my first microphone, and I could use it on anything. I could record acoustic guitars, I could record voiceovers, I could record several people talking or singing at once. It was an amazing microphone to get started with. I acquired it from a former colleague and just got used to using it because it was the microphone that I had, and it happened to be a very versatile and expensive microphone. And it's just been with me for a long time, probably 20 years at this point. I've actually used it to record guitars as well, guitar amplifiers in particular. I started out recording my old 69 Deluxe Reverb and my 74 Princeton Reverb using an SM57 and the AKG C414. At the time, I was playing music out a lot. And like a lot of guitarists, I felt the desire to try to emulate or recreate some of the sounds that I was so in love with, like Albert Collins, Robert Cray, Stevie Ray Vaughan, of course, on the Strat, Freddie King, Albert King, Bonnie Raitt, Joey Landreth, all these guitar players that I just loved listening to. The more I studied those musicians and the way they played music, I couldn't help but become somewhat obsessed with the gear they were using and how they achieved their sound. I got really into the products they were using. So like Robert Cray uses a pair of Clubmans. I think they're 4x10 cabinets, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he also uses a Fender Vibro King sometimes. And I think he also started out on a Super Reverb earlier on in his recording career before he got a hold of the Matchless Clubmans. For me, it wasn't so much about having the specific gear that these folks use, but more of just understanding how they achieved their tone. So was it an EL84 amp? Was it a EL34? Were they using 6L6, 6V6? I started to become more adept at finding a way to cut through a mix on the stage, like increasing the treble and reducing the bass. That also shaped the way that I would play on stage too, because I started to become familiar with what the bass player was playing, what the singer was singing. If there was another guitar player on the stage, where on the neck were they playing the chords that complemented the song? And maybe I could find a different spot on the neck to enhance the overall sonic palette, you know, and fill spaces that needed to be filled rather than stepping on someone else's tone or playing stuff gratuitously. Very early on, I wanted to contribute to the sound. You know, I felt like whenever I was on stage, the thing that appealed to me the most was creating a cohesive sound that I felt like the audience could resonate with. And so that's what I dialed into the most. And by happenstance, you know, it was always my turn to solo at some point. And so that was when I got kind of nerdy about the kind of guitar tone I wanted to achieve in those moments. My gear obsession really started in 2013 after I lost my father. And when I look back and try to understand that initial phase of my gear obsession, it's very obvious to me that I was trying to find a connection to the things that he and I were interested in. And it really turned into a gateway for me, you know, being able to explore my creativity, my creative process, the way that I like to record, the sounds that inspired me. And I got started with a massive amplifier. It was so big. It was a Vox AC30 hand-wired amp with a pair of greenback Celestians, and it was so incredibly heavy and so loud, I couldn't play it the way that it was meant to be played in the places where I was performing. You know, I would play in smaller venues, and it was lunchtime or dinner time. It was a blues jam, you know, those kinds of settings, and the venue made money from selling food and drinks. I was just getting started. I was young, and people weren't lining up outside to pay for tickets just to see my guitar tone. So I had to put that in perspective. It was a very humbling experience, of course, and I ended up downsizing and getting a Princeton Reverb. And at the time, it had the original speaker in it from 1974. It was a 10-inch speaker, and it was about to completely disintegrate. And eventually, I did blow the speaker cone. So I upgraded to a Jupiter ceramic speaker that was incredibly loud for the kind of amp that it was. I was able to achieve high headroom and get that clean, sparkly tone that you often hear people talk about when they're referring to Fender amps, and it was a great amp. I did run into problems when I got into bigger bands that had a horn section and the drummer was like really going for it. I couldn't quite cut through the mix the way that other folks could that had different amps on the stage. And so that's when I realized that a deluxe reverb was probably a better fit for the type of music that I was playing, which was electric blues. For a long time, I just had either a TS-808 or a TS-9 tube screamer and used the onboard reverb or tremolo of the amp to get some interesting sounds. Over time, I started adding things like the Blue Sky from Strymon, and I got a delay pedal, and it changed the way that I approached the music, you know? I could rock a little harder through the amp that I was just like playing straight into for the most part for the longest time. It wasn't until I got back into home recording that I realized it's really hard to be in the same room as these amps. So I tried to do the studio thing and like have the amp sitting in a different room, and I would use my practice space as more of a control room, you know, so I'm just hearing the amp tone into the speakers at this point. The amp was so loud and my room was not designed for this kind of thing, so I could hear the amp like coming in through the walls, and there was a lot of bleed, and it was just so overwhelmingly loud. I started to wish that there was a way that I could feel the amp and use all the pedals that I loved, but just not have it so loud, but be able to create music that inspired me without having to go to a studio every time I had an idea that I wanted to just jot down. Around that same time, my friend John Darling started to help me out with recording and understanding how to get better recordings and just the recording process, you know, like what is a workflow? I didn't have any of these skills, even though I had been messing around with DAWs for a long time, primarily Pro Tools, which was way beyond my skill set. My skill set did not match the capabilities of the software for the longest time. So we got to talking, and he ended up building an ISO cab that had a speaker inside of it filled with like rock wool and Owens Corning. There was a door on the outside of the ISO cab where we could open the flap and adjust the placement of the microphones, switch the microphones out. This all came about after John and I completely renovated my recording space, and I'll get into that in another video, but essentially we could take a tube amplifier and run the speaker cable into the wall that was connected to the ISO cab outside of the room. I could record a guitar tone using my tube amps and a real speaker without having to be in the same room as that loud and overwhelming tone. Experiment, so it didn't sound perfect right out the gate. Like it sounded kind of like squishy, and the way that the air pressure inside that ISO cab moved made it easy for me to get like a really like palm muted, chunky, heavy guitar tone. The ISO cab was so incredibly heavy. It took both of us to get it into the recording space, and it barely fit down the stairwell, and it was just, you know, kind of a Frankenstein piece of gear, and it was so cool because it was all ours, you know, like nobody else was using this exact model. It was completely something that John built from like found parts. We had this idea about maybe we should manufacture these, you know, and like other guitar players are probably experiencing this same kind of desire to have the guitar tone but not have to be in the room with these loud amps all the time. And maybe they don't have access to a studio where there's a control room and an ISO room and a sound engineer on hand. So this is a great way to just capture ideas, at least. Around that time, I discovered the Milkman, the amp, and it just blew my mind because I hadn't been introduced to impulse response yet, or Kemper, or Line 6. I did have a Vox solid-state amp a long time ago, and it had an onboard effects unit, and it had a foot switch that was pretty wild. It had a headphone jack, so I was able to play and practice so that, you know, not everybody in the room had to hear what I was practicing, and it was a lot of fun to explore, and I could also play it at lower volumes. But I never figured out how to record with it. And so when I discovered the amp by Milkman out of San Francisco, it really blew my mind because I could put my effects pedals in front of this little device and push it like it was a real amplifier, and then feed the sound directly into my audio interface and record it. The amp just instantly opened up new avenues of creativity for me. I ended up using the amp to record music with my wife. We did a lot of yoga and music together, and I took that thing to Mexico with me, and I used an Akai Force to program beats and interesting sounds and ambient pads and keys and all this other stuff that I could play to and kind of mix real time, and then use the amp and just create guitar tones on the fly, and it was a lot of fun. Nowadays, it seems like there is an infinite array of products out in the marketplace that allow guitar players to explore their tone and find their sounds, and the recordings are very professional sounding. I saw this clip where Chris Benson was working with Mixwave, and while they were developing like a digital version of the Chimera amp, they sent sound recordings to Chris Benson, and they said something like, guess which recording is the Mixwave plugin and which one is the actual Benson Chimera amp that we mic'd up. See if you can tell the difference. Chris, the amp maker, was like blown away by how accurate the Mixwave plug-in recording sounded. I don't remember offhand if he was able to determine which one was the plug-in and which one was the real amp, but the fact that the maker of the amp had to sit and like critically listen to the differences of the recordings to make a determination, and wasn't even confident, like, you know, I don't know which one is the actual amp and which one is the plug-in version, is a very compelling statement. I've been a fan of the Benson lineup since they got started, partly because I was living in Portland and I could just go over to the shop and talk to these folks. You know, it was just so cool, and they would have musicians come in and play their gear, and you could just kind of like go into the shop and see what they were working on. I cannot imagine a world in which I will completely abandon real amps. I'm obsessed with amps. I like Amplified Nation, I like 2 Rock, I like Victory amps. I'm into Benson and Matchless, of course. I love old Fender amps. I like to play Vox amps. I love all of them. I'm always going to be inspired by the amps and the gear that I have access to. I don't ever want to stop exploring. At the time when my friend John built this ISO cab, we didn't see what was coming next, like the Universal Audio aux top box. That would have solved a lot of our issues because I could have taken my Fender Deluxe reverb or my Fender Princeton reverb and just run it into the aux and, try out different speaker types and microphone types and achieve the results that I was looking for, which was primarily to capture sounds as I was writing music. The aux came out a few years after we had spent all this time building and dialing in the ISO cab that we so lovingly admired. I thought about having it wrapped in Tolex at one point, and that was kind of an outrageous idea because of the weight of the thing and how difficult it would have been to try to get that done in a way that looked good. But I'm always going to love that thing. But in terms of being a guitar player today, there are so many creative options out there, and I think it's great. I think it opens up a lot of doors for guitar players to explore their creativity. With the Neural Quad Cortex, for example, there's a lot of presets that you can just scroll through and try out different sounds that you might not have otherwise thought to try out. You can go from a high gain amp to ambient wash, or like a synth sound or an octave fuzz sound just by, clicking a few buttons. So what you're seeing on my screen right now is a stereo input for the Neural Quad Cortex. And you can see that when I play, it's receiving a signal. Over here, you can see the Cortex Control application. I can also use the tactile version of the Quad Cortex to do things like engage effects. When I engage the octave effect, it actually also engages the bass overdrive Soviet fuzz effect. And that is because I latched those two effects so that they're connected to one another. Now, I can also do things like add a reverb, for example. So if I add lush plate, crank the mix on that just so you can hear. So that's how I can add an effect in the Quad Cortex, and I can turn that effect off and I'm back to the bass setting. And this is just the Brit Bass 50 patch that I just grabbed from the Quad Cortex directory. It's a Quad Cortex preset that comes standard with the device, so everybody who has the version of the software I'm running would also have access to that. As you can see on my screen, I've created a splitter, so the input will go through this row of effects, and what I mean by effects, I've got a bass amp here, and then I've got a speaker, and you can see where the microphones are placed, virtually, of course, inside the plugin. And I've split the channels so that I can go through the poly octavator, like an octave pedal in this case, for example. And then it goes through the reverb back into the standard signal chain. I can add and remove effects by clicking the X here, or if I just click on the empty region here, you can add an effect that way as well. So let's take a look at what that sounds like. Now, if I add the fuzz into that, it really beefs up the signal. Now, if I were to engage the plush reverb right now, you'll hear what that sounds like. Not bad, right? Now we can check out other presets as well. So if I go to the Cortex Control, which is linked to my physical Quad Cortex, but I find that it's
kind of fun to navigate the program this way. I'm just going to scroll really fast, and there you go. I don't know. Click on Poor Man's Double. Let's see what that does. Kind of trippy, right? Let's see what we got going on here. Wow, fun. And this is just out-of-the-box preset. So I can see that there's a pitch shifter. We've got a vintage chorus modulation effect happening, as well as some compression. We've got some delay going on here, a couple of EQ options, lots of reverb, and it sounds like this. Not bad. Let's see if we can find some high gain sounds. Fun, right?
The Quad Cortex is especially wild because you can actually capture the sound of a real amp you own and take that sound with you. Check out Zach Wish and his thoughts on using the Quad Cortex while on tour with Seal. I'm so grateful that the software developers work with the builders to create a sound that the builders can sign off on, and I hope the amp makers are capitalizing on this opportunity to, increase revenue instead of just relying solely on selling amp hardware and pedals, that's actually helping them scale their business, because I want them to keep making stuff that I can play. I definitely want to do my part in giving back to the music community in whatever way I can. And I do that by purchasing pedals and amps every couple years when I can. And I try my best to keep in mind that I feel like it's a tricky balance for amp manufacturers who are competing with that digital space where you can now purchase an amp for $130 that runs on your computer and sounds quite good from a studio recording standpoint, at least for home recordings and coming up with ideas and just capturing those initial thoughts. Anyway, my sinuses are starting to freak out. If you can't tell, I'm gonna go and drink some water and sip tea for the rest of the day. I just wanted to share my thoughts on this stuff, and I'm curious if you're a guitar player, like what comes up from you? What was your experience? Did you start with real amps and then move into the digital space, or have you only ever used amp sims and amp modelers and have never felt the power of a 2x12 cranked up? Have you ever played through a Marshall or a Benson Chimera or whatever your favorite boutique amp maker happens to be? If you've only done one or the other, I encourage you to, play around and explore and see what works best for you and the way that you like to play and see what inspires you. Maybe you can come up with a new sound that you never thought of and just happened upon. For me, that's where a lot of the magic lies. And when I can just stumble onto that stuff and it takes me a whole new direction, it's very fulfilling and rewarding. And it's one of the reasons that I keep making music, because that feeling is very powerful. And I just really hope that more people can experience it, Have fun, try out some gear, and let me know what you think in the comment section below. I hope you have a great day. Now go make some noise.